right now we head to Bristol, Connecticut to talk with Brad Edwards, ESPN college football analyst. As you would imagine, Brad, we're celebrating in Tuscaloosa. The old man's done it again. Number one recruiting class, according to your publication, ESPN.com.
Yeah, impressive, especially when you consider, to me, this is really the third time that Nick Saban has had to reevaluate something he was doing that had, up to that point, had a ton of success. First it was on the defensive side when, they started struggling to defend some of the up-tempo offenses with mobile quarterbacks, and it didn't take him losing, a bunch of games to figure out that he needed to make a change. And, he got faster on defense. We saw him make the switch also offensively to more up-tempo and with a quarterback who was also a threat to run. And now with everything that happened with recruiting last year, made some more changes, and here he is back on top. And this is what makes him the best of all time, is that he doesn't need a catastrophic event in order to convince him that changes need to be made. And, for a lot of people, there would have been nothing wrong with having 1 year where they finished fifth or sixth. But for Nick Saban, that wasn't good enough. And he went out and did it. And I think the way that they closed today, I realize it doesn't officially close into the first week of February, but for them to get the signatures they needed on paper today was a big deal as far as just cementing that they had not been surpassed, as a lot of people thought after last year that Georgia was going to blow by Alabama. And, I guess just, Ryan, the last point on this nationally is that I think we're always looking for signs that the foundation of the dynasty is cracking, that we may be just a year or two away from someone overtaking Alabama. And this certainly would have been it. If Alabama had not been able to respond from last year and had, even if they finished third or fourth, which once again still would have been very good, just not up to the standard that had gotten Alabama to where it is now, then I think we would have started to say, yep, I think we can see the first signs that it's slipping away. But we're taking an honest look at it now. We're still waiting for that first legitimate sign that Alabama may be on the way down, because if there is a sign, it's not obvious.
Well, and Brad, I think you look at what Nick Saban, and I'm going to take some words that your colleague there at ESPN and the National Signing Day coverage that started early this morning, and Tom Luganbill kept saying that this may be, on paper, Nick Saban's best signing class that he's put together ever when we talk about Nick Saban. And there's been some great ones, but he thinks this one has a chance to be Nick Saban's best. That's not a good message if you're trying to take down the Tide from an opposition standpoint.
No, it's not. And I think the reason he's saying that is because what they did on the line of scrimmage, like both sides of the ball, that's obviously the foundation. As much as we want to talk about quarterback play and the running backs and even the receivers at times, DBs certainly fall into that category. Ultimately, these games are won and lost at the line of scrimmage. And in order for someone to overtake Alabama, they're going to have to get to a point where they can beat them, or at the very least hold their own at the line of scrimmage, and then outplay them with the athletes elsewhere. And it doesn't appear that day is coming anytime soon with what they just put together in this signing class. So I think, ultimately the results in the field will show how good the signing class was or is. But, it's funny that the 2017 class, to me at the time it was signed, I didn't hear, people saying, wow, this might be Saban's best class ever. But then when you look at the fourth quarter of the national championship game and you got like 6 of those guys out there on the field with the game hanging in the balance, you realize what a great class it was. And of course, those guys have gone on to do more great things this year. And I think we just it's kind of been reinforced what type of signing class. And I think in the same way that a few years in, you realized how great that 2008 class was. So this could end up being another one that, keeps this thing going for a few more years.
We're talking to Brad Edwards, ESPN College Game Day host, college football insider for ESPN.com, analyst for College Game Day on ESPN Radio that you hear here on Tide 102.9. You put together a podcast, which is the Campus Conversation with Ivan Maisel and Jake Trotter as well. And you were talking about Coach of the Year. We're always making the case here that Nick Saban deserves some consideration. I know he never exceeds the expectation because the expectation is to win a national title. But this year, if you look at it, we were all discussing it throughout the offseason, replacing both coordinators, all the new coaches. all the players that have departed to the National Football League, and now look at what he's been able to do, but he seems to never get that consideration of Coach of the Year vote.
Yeah, I think part of this is because on the Nick Saban scale, the only way to be able to consider it a great season or even a successful season is to win the whole thing. And obviously that's a piece of information that we don't have until after the voting has already been done. And maybe that's something that's held against him, that he's a victim of his own success when it comes to National Coach of the Year, because for Nick Saban to have done an even acceptable job by Nick Saban standards, the season has to end with a national championship. And until they've won a national championship, it just kind of feels like it's premature to call him the Coach of the Year. So maybe we'll never see him win another National Coach of the Year award. It's really, if you think about it, it's hard to imagine how it could happen, because the expectation will continue to be that they should be in the playoff, if not, more than that, than the number one seed in the playoff. And so it's a bar that you can't exceed. Like, you can meet the expectation, as you were saying, but you can't really outperform the expectation when it's as high as it could possibly be.
Brad, I want to go to another part of recruiting here for just a minute, and I want you to look into your crystal ball, and you look at Texas A&M. What can Jimbo Fisher do at Texas A&M with all the resources that he's provided? He's a dynamic recruiter. We know the history of that state in producing big-time college, high school football players that end up playing on the college game. How far can Jimbo Fisher take Texas A&M?
Well, I've always felt like A&M was a sleeping giant.
Yeah,
I
me
know
too.
I'm not alone there. When you look at just the recruiting base they have, not just because they're in the state of Texas, but just being as close to Houston as they are. But they're on the Dallas side of Houston, so they're not too far from the whole DFW area either. And you put that with all the money that's available to them, the facilities that they already have. It just seems like there's no reason whatsoever that they shouldn't, and really shouldn't have been for decades, as mediocre as they really have been for the most part. So this has been an ongoing thing with A&M. Like, when are they ever going to reach that potential? And certainly they felt like the hire of Jimbo Fisher was a big step toward getting them there. I'm not personally completely sold on Jimbo. I mean, he is one of very few coaches active right now who has a national championship, and that obviously means a lot. But I look at what he did at Florida State from a recruiting standpoint, and I have a hard time believing that he will put together a more talented roster at A&M than he did at Florida State. It might be equally talented, but it's not going to be more talented. I don't think he's going to get better players than he had at FSU. The question is, can he do more with them? Because really, outside of 2 years with Jameis Winston, the eventual number one pick in the draft, as his quarterback, Jimbo, in my opinion, underachieved for most of his years at Florida State. Certainly never contended for the national championship late in the season outside of those 2 years with Jameis. And even the second of those years, they were just waiting to be exposed. I mean, they were a much better team in 2013 than they were in 2014 when they were, coming from behind the second half and winning these close games, a lot of them against teams that weren't nearly as good as they were. And so, look, I could make a great argument that the year he won the national title is really the only time in his head coaching career that his team performed up to its talent level. And so I think there's a lot left to be proved on his end as far as being able to maximize the amount of talent that he is once again putting together on his roster. We'll see. I mean, we know that Nick Saban is as good of a coach as he was at LSU. After a change of scenery, and obviously he had to stop at the NFL in between, he's been a better coach at Alabama. And I think that to be fair to Jimbo, we'll give him a chance at A&M to see if the change of scenery and maybe learning some things at Florida State might make him a better coach at his second stop. I guess it wasn't Saban's second stop, but it was his next stop. So we'll see about Jimbo. But at the moment, I'm not buying into Jimbo being one of those guys who's a slam dunk to take a really talented roster and win at a high level, because I saw him fail to do it too many times at Florida State.
We're talking to Brad Edwards, ESPN college football analyst, ESPN college football analyst. Brad, let me ask you, because you're a guy that's plugged in there at ESPN. What is the word about Marquis Brown, Hollywood Brown? Do you think he'll be able to go? Because, here in Tuscaloosa, it looks like Tua is getting closer day by day to 100%. He even told a group of media earlier this morning that he would be playing in the Oklahoma-Alabama game. We thought that might be a little bit of a decoy that Nick Saban would be using. That doesn't seem to be the case. Out in Norman, what's the latest with Marquis Brown that you've heard?
Yeah, so Hollywood Brown was injured in the Big 12 championship game, and the cameras caught him on the sideline after the team doctors had looked at him. And he had one of those looks that we're all familiar with if we've watched enough football, where just that look of not just disappointment but complete dejection. I think he was almost in tears. And what was tough to read was, you knew for certain he wasn't coming back into the Big 12 championship game, and that was in the third quarter in a very close game. So was his emotion because his game was over? And it was, by the way, it was still hanging in the balance, and the chance that they wouldn't make the playoff if they didn't win the game and maybe win impressively enough. And so that could have been the reason. It also could have been more than that, which is that he knew his season was over. We don't know. Lincoln Riley has been very tight-lipped about it. I think after the selection committee revealed the rankings and they found out that Oklahoma was in, he said he was hopeful. And outside of one other update, there hasn't been much said. And so we don't have a lot to go off of. It's been, we've seen all the stuff with Tua at Alabama practice, and you see how he's moving around. There's nothing coming out of Oklahoma as far as their practices or any video of him and how he's moving around. So Jake Trotter, who is as dialed into Oklahoma as anyone we have at ESPN, said the other day that they are hopeful, and what he's hearing from people is that they believe that he's going to be able to play. I've heard different things from other people that they're more pessimistic, but we really don't know. I mean, that's the thing is we don't know. Is he out there, out of pads, just watching practice? Is he trying to go through drills? Is he out there running around already looking like he's close to 100%, as Tua seems to be? No idea, but you were right to be asking about this, because it's not as big of a deal as if Tua were to be out, but it's still a very big deal because you're talking about the most dangerous receiver on one of the best offenses in the country, and it's not like they're not six deep at receiver where they can not have a drop off if he's not in there. I think this is a huge deal to Oklahoma's offense if he's not able to go, and I think that's still very much in question.
For Oklahoma to win this game, does it have to be a shootout? I mean, that's the style of play that really benefits them the most if it is a shootout?
I would say yes, in terms of shootout being defined by both teams scoring almost every time they have the ball. The Big 12 championship game was a strange game in the way that it played out, where both teams were just kind of running at a slower tempo than they did in the regular season. And even though both of them were scoring pretty frequently, the game was just moving slower. I still think on top of it, they got more stops than they did the first time they met, but that ended up being a lower scoring game. And I don't see that giving Oklahoma much of a chance. It's funny. I've heard people say, "Oh, Alabama should just take just kind of take the model that Army used against Oklahoma and control possession, just run the ball, keep the Oklahoma offense on the field or off the field." I disagree. I think Alabama just needs to put the pedal down, do what they've been doing all year offensively. And the truth of the matter is, these are the two best offenses in college football, but one team's defense, Alabama's, is a lot better than the other one. And the more possessions there are, I think the more that the number of stops that the defense is able to get is going to tilt in Alabama's favor. So I think for Oklahoma to win this game, they have to score in the 50s. I think you and I have talked about this before in the last couple of weeks. I just don't see how, if this game is played at a normal pace, Oklahoma could hold Alabama under 50. So I think that's the bare minimum the Sooners have to score to have a chance to win. And if Hollywood Brown is not able to play or isn't 100%, I'm not even sure that's possible.
Brad, we're talking about the SEC, and I still don't know if we can understand how bad Oklahoma's defense really is. We had a guy on that was their sideline reporter last week, and we were talking about West Virginia and Oklahoma, and he said, well, that was one of their better performances defensively. And I kind of come to this. Ole Miss was not a good defense. Are they worse than Ole Miss defensively?
No, they're not. In fact, it's funny. I actually just got through doing something on this for SportsCenter that'll run next week. What I did is I took apart Alabama's schedule and I threw out the 5 top 20 defenses by our defensive efficiency metric. There are 5 Alabama opponents that rank top 20 defensively. I threw them out, and I threw out the teams that ranked behind Oklahoma in defensive efficiency, and that left me with 4 teams that were basically within 40 spots of Oklahoma, but ahead of Oklahoma. So these are 4 teams on Alabama's schedule that were better than Oklahoma defensively by our metrics, but not a ton better. And out of that group, I would tell you the one that ranks closest to Oklahoma is Arkansas. Arkansas is a little bit better defensively than Oklahoma. But anyway, what I did when I looked at those 4 games combined, in the first 3 quarters, and I only looked at the first 3 quarters of the games because we all know that's really all Alabama's starting offense played was the first 3 quarters. And even in those games, Tua wasn't in for all of those 3 quarters. Part of it was Jalen. But in those 4 games, Alabama's offense averaged 50 points for the first 3 quarters alone, 9.6 yards per play. And so I think that's kind of what you're looking at. You know, that should be what Alabama is able to do to Oklahoma's defense if they pick up where they left off. And what I'm saying is as long as there's not a lot of rust coming out of a 4-week layoff, then that's what Alabama should do based on what others have done against Oklahoma. And another way I think you could look at this, Ryan, is that people nationally, I don't know about in the SEC, but people nationally have a hard time just kind of making this transition mentally to Alabama having an elite offense. We're so used to Alabama having a certain offensive style in previous years that it is kind of difficult for people to accept that Alabama offensively this year is better than West Virginia. They're better than Oklahoma State. They're better than Texas Tech. And those are 3 teams in the Big 12 that absolutely lit up Oklahoma's defense late in the season. They're not as explosive offensively, and especially when it comes to balance and being able to run the ball well. Oklahoma State is a decent running team. The others don't really run it well at all. And yet, even without that element of the running game that Alabama has, they were able to torch Oklahoma defensively. So unless Alabama just comes out and is sloppy and guys are dropping passes like they did in the SEC championship game, unless Tua is missing open receivers, I don't see how Oklahoma gets enough stops to be able to win the game because the plays will be there to be made. It's not like Oklahoma is going to get a lot better defensively, over a 4-week span. It's just a matter of Alabama executing.